The forest takes its time eating things. A two-story mansion stands swallowed in vines. The roof has caved in 3 places. Tall grass moves around the wheels of a car that nobody has driven since before color television. There are 10 more cars behind it. And at the back of the property, half buried in moss, sit 2 passenger airplanes with their propellers twisted toward the sky like hands. 11 cars, 2 airplanes, 1 mansion. Wind moves through windows that no longer hold glass. A wrought iron gate. 2 letters at the top, rust-eaten down to almost nothing. An S and a V. A young woman stands at that gate, 18 years old. A green suitcase with a broken wheel at her feet. $16 in her pocket. Wet December air in her lungs. She looks at the house. The house looks back. Something in there has been waiting. Look at what stands in front of me right now. A 2-story mansion, swallowed whole by the forest. Roof caved in at 3 different spots. Windows hollow as empty eye sockets. Ivy crawling up the rotting wooden walls like the woods are trying to eat the whole place before anyone can figure out what happened here. At the gate, rusting in the tall grass, sits an old automobile with a body so corroded you can barely tell what color it used to be. Tires sunk into the earth. Windshield shattered so long ago the glass turned to dust. And that's not all. Because what comes next is gonna make you stop breathing for a full second. On this property, there are 11 abandoned cars. 11. Some with their doors hanging open, like the owner stepped out for a minute and never came back. Others with hoods propped up, like somebody started a repair 50 years ago and just walked away mid-wrench. There's a sedan from the 40s with an oak tree growing through the roof. Literally. Straight through. A pickup truck so covered in moss, it looks like part of the landscape. Like it grew out of the dirt with the rest of the woods. And at the back of the property, half hidden in the green, there are 2 airplanes, not toy planes, not crop dusters, real airplanes. 1 twin engine. Paint peeled clean down to bare metal. Propellers twisted sideways like arms reaching for something they'll never touch. The other one wrapped in dark moss so thick you'd swear the trees pulled it down themselves. Landing gear sunk to the axles. Like the airplane spent decades trying to take off, and the earth just refused to let it go. Who lived here? Why 11 cars and 2 airplanes in the front yard of a mansion? That the woods are eating alive? What happened in this place? That made it possible to just walk away and leave everything behind. Like time stopped one afternoon, and nobody ever bothered to start it again. I'm gonna tell you everything. But first, you need to understand how I ended up standing at that gate, 18 years old, with nowhere to sleep, and $16 in my pocket. My name is Hattie Monroe, and the night my mother closed the door on me, it was a Tuesday in December. That door wasn't a fancy door, wasn't metal, wasn't behind some gated community. It was just a wood door with a brass handle that always stuck in winter. The door I'd painted blue with my mother when I was 8. On a Saturday afternoon, I can still smell the smell of fresh paint. The smell of the lemonade Grandma Pearl had set on the porch step in a green plastic cup. The smell of wet dirt because it had rained that morning. A perfect afternoon. One of those afternoons you store away. Without knowing you're storing it away. Because at the time, you don't yet understand. That afternoon will be the closest thing to perfection you're going to get for a very long time. It was that door. And it was my mother who closed it. I needed years to understand what happened that night. Not because it was complicated. It wasn't. It was simple. And it was cruel. The way only family things manage to be both at once. My stepfather had come into our lives 4 years earlier, when I was 14. His name was Mort. I was never rude to him, never hostile, never disrespectful. I didn't do what teenagers do when a stranger walks into the place where their father used to stand. I tried. I really did. But Mort never wanted my trying. He wanted the house. He wanted my mother. And I was a piece of the package he hadn't asked for. 4 years. The weather got heavier. The silences got longer. The dinners we ate without speaking weighed more than the fights ever could. And then on a Thursday night, Mort gave my mother an ultimatum. Either Hattie goes or I go. I heard it through the wall, with my ear pressed against the paint. I heard his voice, flat, final. I heard the silence that came after. A silence that lasted way longer than I thought it would. And then I heard my mother, with a voice I would never get out of my head as long as I lived. She said, "All right." Just one word. My mother used one word to decide what happened to me. The next morning, she called me into the living room, sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap like she was about to read me a court document. She didn't look at me. She looked somewhere between the carpet and the window. She said I needed to think about my future, that I was 18 now, that it was time to be independent, that she'd help where she could. But the situation in the house had become impossible. She didn't cry, didn't hug me, just kept talking like she was reading aloud from a memo somebody had typed up for her. 7 days. That's what I had. 1 week to pack my things and find somewhere else to be. I spent those 7 days in a state of numb that I didn't even recognize as numbness. I went to my part-time job at the grocery store. I came home. I stared at the ceiling. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because something inside me had flipped over into emergency mode. An emergency mode doesn't allow feelings, only motion. But on the 5th day, something happened that I didn't expect. I was cleaning out my closet, just trying to figure out what I could fit in the green suitcase, the one with the broken wheel we'd never fixed. And I found a shoebox. Not mine. My mother's. Pushed all the way to the back, behind a stack of old textbooks she'd kept since high school. I should have just put it back. I know. But I didn't. Because something about the way it was hidden, something about how nobody had touched it in years. The lid sealed with a thin layer of dust. I opened it, and what I found made me sit down on the floor of the closet and try to breathe. Sheet music. Pages and pages of sheet music. Handwritten, with pencil markings in the margins. Notes in a young woman's handwriting that I recognized as my mother's, but softer, younger, curvier than the handwriting that wrote my grocery lists now. And underneath the sheet music, a program from a college. Some music school in Boston I'd never heard her mention. Sylvia Monroe, Junior Piano Recital, Spring 1991. I read the name 3 times. Sylvia Monroe, my mother. A junior at a music school in Boston in 1991. And then, at the bottom of the box, a photograph. A young woman, maybe 20, sitting at a grand piano, hair down to her waist, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, fingers on the keys like they were part of her hands. It took me a second to understand. That was my mother. That was my mother before me. I sat on the closet floor with the photograph in my lap, and I started doing the math in my head. The math I'd never done before. Because she was 20 in 1991. She had me in 1996, which meant she'd been in music school, studying piano. And then she got pregnant with me. And she didn't go back. I sat there for a long time, and I understood something that I'd never wanted to understand. My mother, the woman who had just sentenced me to leave my own house with a single word, wasn't bitter because of Mort, wasn't bitter because of money, wasn't bitter because of the small town we lived in. She was bitter because of me, because I was the reminder of the woman she could have been. I closed the lid of the shoebox, put it back where I'd found it, pushed the textbooks in front of it, and I walked out of her closet like I'd never been in there. And I never told her that I knew, because what would I even say? Sorry I was born. Sorry I cost you the piano. There's nothing you can say to that. Nothing that doesn't make it worse. On the 7th night, I took the green suitcase, loaded everything that fit, some clothes, my documents, a little notebook I'd been keeping since I was 15, the phone charger with the frayed cable, a picture of me with Grandma Pearl from when I was 6. She was holding my hand and pointing at something off camera. Her face was lit up. Pearl had died when I was 11. And the rest stayed behind, as if it had never been mine. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked out. I stopped at the door, held the handle for a second, waiting for her to come into the hallway, waiting for her to say my name, waiting for anything. But nothing came, just the sound of the television in the living room, and the smell of coffee that always lived in the walls of that house. I closed the door behind me, picked up the suitcase, the one with the broken wheel that wobbled and dragged, went down the porch steps, through the gate, and started walking down the street. December in Tennessee. The kind of December where the wet cold gets in your lungs and stays there. I was 18 years old, a broken suitcase, $16 in my wallet, and absolutely nowhere to go. I made it 6 blocks before my legs stopped. There was a bus stop, just a metal bench under one of those tin shelters. I sat down, put the suitcase between my feet, and I stared at nothing for a long time. Buses came, buses went, doors opened, doors closed. People got on, people got off, and I sat there like a piece of luggage somebody had forgotten. I remember thinking a lot of things that night. I thought about Grandma Pearl, who would have lost her mind if she'd known what was happening. Pearl, who used to say, "The Lord puts us exactly where we need to be, even when we can't see the map." Pearl, who used to pat my hand and tell me, "You're stronger than you know, baby. You just haven't met the storm yet." I thought about my high school English teacher, Mrs. Gentry, who told me once that I had a way with words and I should think about writing for a living. I thought about how I was never going to afford college now. I thought about how I was going to eat tomorrow. I thought about how life sometimes feels like a trap. That closes so slowly, you don't notice it closing. Until one day, you're inside it, and there's no way out. And then I thought about something that surprised me. Even at the time, I thought, if I don't do something completely different, right now, if I don't break some pattern, some logical path, some obvious next step, I'm going to disappear. Not in a dramatic way, in a silent way. The way invisible people disappear. I was going to become one of those people that life just steamrolls over, and nobody notices. And then, for the first time in years, I prayed. Just a few words, whispered into the December air at a bus stop on Highway 70. I said, "Lord, if you can hear me, I don't know what to do. Please, just show me one thing, one step. That's all I'm asking for." I waited for some kind of feeling. There wasn't one, but there was. Almost. Underneath the cold. Underneath the panic. Something like the feeling of a hand on my shoulder. So light I might have imagined it. I picked up the suitcase, and I called Rosalind. Rosalind worked the cash register next to mine at the grocery store. 22 years old, 2 kids, a studio apartment above the laundromat on Spring Street. She had her own kind of tired, the kind that lives in the bones. She answered on the 4th ring. I said, "Roz, I need a sofa." She said, "How bad?" I said, "Bad." She said, "Come." 3 words. That's all it took. And I walked another 9 blocks, with the broken suitcase dragging behind me, to the only door in town that opened. Rosalind's apartment smelled like baby formula and dish soap. Her 2 boys were already asleep in the bedroom. She'd left the couch made up for me with a flat pillow and a quilt her grandmother had stitched. She looked at me with that face people make when they're doing somebody a favor that's bigger than they can afford. She said, 3 days, Hattie. I love you, but 3 days. That's all I got." I said, "I understand." I went to my shift the next morning like nothing had happened. Pulled my apron on. Scanned groceries. smiled at customers, asked old men if they wanted paper or plastic, came back to Roseland's, slept on the couch, did it again. By the second day, I was already running out of time. By the third day, I went on my lunch break to the newsstand on the corner of 5th and Main, the one Mr. Pruitt ran out of a converted shipping container. Mr. Pruitt had let me read the classifieds for free since I was 16. He never asked why. He just nodded at me when I came in, and nodded again when I left. That afternoon, I was flipping through the classifieds in the back of the Tennessean, looking for room rentals, cheap apartments, anything. And then I saw it, a small ad, tucked between a listing for a used tractor and a wanted ad for a part-time dishwasher. It was different from all the others, shorter, drier, and it had a note at the end that none of the other listings had. Property for sale, rural acreage, 22 miles north of town, large structure, needs work, price negotiable for a reasonable offer. We do not answer questions about the history of the property. I read it 3 times. We do not answer questions about the history of the property. What kind of person puts that in an ad? I pulled out my phone, searched the address. Nothing useful came up, just satellite images of woods. So I tried Facebook. Local groups, people who post about the county. I typed the road name into a search bar. And what came up made me stop breathing. There was a photograph, taken from a distance with a bad camera, like whoever took it had been afraid to get any closer. And in that photograph, in the middle of a property completely swallowed by tall grass, there was the mansion. It wasn't just an old house. It was a real mansion, 2 stories, stone facade, enormous arched windows with broken glass, a wrought iron gate that hadn't opened in decades, trees that had grown up through the structure, branches reaching out through the windows like the woods were holding hands with whatever was inside. The roof had collapsed in at least 3 places. There were plants growing on what used to be a front porch. But what made my throat close up was what was on the property. Even in that blurry photo, taken from a quarter mile away, you could see vehicles, lots of them, way too many to be normal. And at the back, almost lost in the trees, 2 silhouettes that were not cars. In the comments under that photo, the whole county had opinions. Somebody wrote that his grandfather used to say, nobody could stay there more than a week. Somebody wrote that the place had been cursed since 1968, and everyone in the county knew it. Somebody said a whole family had vanished there and never been found. Somebody said the county had condemned it and was going to bulldoze it any month now. There was a woman who wrote in all capitals, "Do not buy that property, for the love of God, do not." I read every comment, and the more I read, the more something strange started happening in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was almost the opposite of fear. It was something like recognition. Like when you see something for the first time and still have the impossible feeling that you've seen it before. I looked at that photograph for a long time, and what I saw was not a haunted ruin. What I saw was a roof, 4 walls, a place nobody else wanted, a place nobody was going to fight me for, a place where nobody was going to close a door on me, because there was nobody left to close it. I saw an opportunity that the entire world had thrown away. I called the number the next morning, before my shift, standing in Rosalind's bathroom with the door locked so the boys wouldn't hear me. It rang for a long time. 8 rings, 9, 10. When the voice on the other end finally picked up, it was a man's voice, old, tired, the way a voice sounds when it hasn't been used in days. He said, "Hello," the way you say hello when you weren't expecting anyone to call, ever, about anything. I asked about the property. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Did you read the part of the ad about not asking questions?" I said, "Yes, sir, I read it." He waited. I said, "I'm not calling about the history. I'm calling because I need a place to live. And what I have is what I have." He was quiet for so long that I thought the call had dropped. I almost said hello. But then I heard him take a breath, slow, deliberate, like a man weighing something with both hands. He said, "How old are you, ma'am?" I said, 18. Another silence, and then, in a different voice, a voice that had something underneath it I couldn't name yet, he said, "Do you really have nowhere else to go?" I felt my throat close up, because nobody had asked me that. The whole week. Nobody. I said, "No, sir, I don't." The silence that followed felt longer than the 7 days I'd been counting down to my own eviction. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed again, softer, and there was something in it that I didn't understand until much later. Something like a man who'd been carrying a weight for a very, very long time and had just felt the weight shift. He said, "Then maybe you're the one." I said, "Sir," he said, "never mind. Are you coming to see it in person before you decide?" I said, "Yes," he said, "tomorrow, 10 in the morning. If you still want to buy after you see it, the place is yours, for what you have." He hung up before I could ask his name. I sat down on the closed toilet lid in Rosalind's bathroom, holding the phone, shaking a little. And I couldn't tell if I'd just done the bravest thing of my life or the most stupid. I told Rosalind that night, after the boys were in bed. She was washing dishes, with her back to me, and when I told her, she didn't turn around right away. She just kept moving the sponge over the same plate, slow, like she was buying time. She said, "Honey, are you serious?" I said, "Yes." She turned around, with her hands still wet, and gave me the look people give you when they know you're about to make a bad decision, but the decision is too far down the hill to be stopped now. She said, "How much?" I said, $16. She closed her eyes. She said, "Hattie, Lord have mercy, I said. I know, she said. And he agreed, I said. He agreed. She turned back to the sink, dried her hands on the towel, and she said, Then I'm coming with you tomorrow, I said. Roz, you don't have to, she said. 18 years old, buying a mansion in the woods from a man who won't answer questions with $16. She turned around. She said, I am 100% coming with you. We took 2 buses the next morning. The first one ran straight up Highway 70, through the parts of town I knew, past the high school, past the Piggly Wiggly, past the church I'd been baptized in, then out past the city limits, where the gas stations got further apart and the trees got taller. The second bus dropped us at a county road that didn't have a name on the sign, just a number. Highway 421 South. From there, we walked 1.5 miles on a dirt road that climbed up into the foothills of the Smokies. The kind of road that bends and bends, and you keep thinking you've reached the top, until you bend again. I had the suitcase with me. I don't know why. I just couldn't leave it behind. Rosalind was wearing tennis shoes, and she did not complain. Not once, even when the road got steep. She just walked beside me, looking at the trees, then looking at me, then looking at the trees again. When we came around the last bend, she stopped. Just stopped. In the middle of the road. And she said, Hattie. I said, Yeah. She said, Hattie. That's all she could say, because in front of us was the gate, a wrought iron gate, easily 10 feet tall, with curling letters at the top that the rust had eaten down to almost nothing. You could barely make out the shape of 2 letters anymore. An S and a V behind the gate. A driveway curving up to a stone facade that didn't belong in Tennessee. Didn't belong in this century. Stone arches, tall windows, the kind of house you'd see in a French film, crumbling slow into the woods. And in the field between the gate and the house, the cars. I had seen the blurry photograph, but standing there, in person, you don't understand. Until you stand there, a Ford from the 40s, completely covered in brick red rust, almost unrecognizable as a vehicle anymore. A Chevrolet from the 50s, roof caved in from decades of rain and weight. A pickup truck, whose cab had been colonized by a bush growing from the inside out. A European sports car. That had once been beautiful, now lying on the ground, with no tires, just 4 piles of dirt where the wheels used to be, and 3 more I couldn't even identify. Make, model, year. The rust and the moss had eaten everything that used to distinguish them. And then, at the back of the property, visible now from where we stood, the 2 airplanes. In person, they were even more impossible to understand. They weren't small. They weren't crop dusters. They were the kind of planes that carry passengers on regional routes, with wingspans that made the whole scene completely irrational. How did they get there? How does anybody land an airplane that size, on private land, without anyone noticing, without anyone remembering, without any record of it? anywhere. Rosalind whispered. "Hattie," I said. "I know," she said. "Hattie," I said. "I see them. I see them." She said. "Two airplanes," I said. "Yes." We just stood there for a while until a vehicle pulled up behind us, slow, crunching gravel. A small brown sedan from the 80s, the kind that wheezes when it parks. The driver door opened, and out stepped a thin old man with completely white hair, wearing a sport coat that might have been elegant decades ago. He was carrying a leather key ring that had probably been new during the Carter administration. He looked at me, then at Rosalind, then at the suitcase. He said, "You're the one who called," I said. "Yes, sir." He said. "Name," I said. "Hattie Monroe," he said. "Ezra Vance." He nodded once, like he was confirming something in his own head. Then he turned, walked to the gate, pulled out the brass key from his leather ring, and slid it into the lock. The lock turned with a heaviness that made the whole gate creak. He pushed. The hinges screamed. The gate swung open with a slowness that felt almost ceremonial. Ezra Vance stepped aside, and he said, "Come in." We walked up the gravel drive, past the rusting cars, past the Ford with the tree growing through it, past the pickup with the bush in the cab, past the European sports car on its piles of dirt. The closer we got to the mansion, the smaller we felt. Ezra walked ahead of us, without saying a word. He didn't tour guide. He didn't explain. He just walked, like he was completing a chore he'd put off for too long. He showed us the front room, where the ceiling had partially collapsed in 3 places, sunlight cutting through in long, bright bars. He showed us the kitchen, a massive cast-iron stove still squatting against the wall, with an iron pot still on top of it, like somebody had walked away in the middle of dinner and just never come back. 2 bathrooms downstairs, completely overtaken by mold. A wooden staircase that creaked on every step, but held our weight. 3 bedrooms upstairs, 2 with compromised ceilings. A library, empty. The wooden shelves still intact, covered in dust and cobwebs. But you could see the shape of what they used to hold. And at no point did Ezra Vance say anything about the history. He didn't say who built it. He didn't say who lived here. He didn't explain the cars. He didn't even glance at the airplanes. He just walked. And he watched me. He watched my face. Every time I looked at something new. When we came back down to the front room, he pulled a yellowed plastic folder from his coat pocket, opened it, laid the papers out on the dust-covered table by the door. He said, "Deed, title, tax records, survey from 1953. I looked at the papers. I looked at the room. I looked through the broken window, at the gate, at the cars, at the airplanes in the distance. And I said, I want it." Ezra Vance looked at me. For a second, his face did something. It wasn't surprise. It was closer to relief. like a man who had been carrying a stone in his pocket for 40 years and had just been told he could put it down. He said, $16. I said, "Yes, sir." I reached into the inside pocket of the suitcase, the one I'd zipped my entire life into the night before. I pulled out a 10, a 5, and a single dollar bill. I laid them on the table. He looked at the money. He looked at me. And then he did something I didn't expect. He reached out with a hand that trembled, and he closed it gently over mine. His skin was cold. His eyes were wet. He said, "I have been waiting for a long time for someone to come by this place." I didn't say anything. He kept his hand on mine. He said, "A lot of people have come. A lot. Over the years. They drove up. They walked the property. They asked their questions. And every one of them, every single one, eventually got back in their car and drove away." I felt Rosalind step closer behind me. He said, "You are the first one who did not ask about what happened here." He paused. He looked at the broken window, at the field with the cars, at the airplanes you could just barely see beyond. Then he looked back at me, and he said, "Maybe that's because you brought your own history with you." He let go of my hand. He pushed the keys across the table. He picked up his folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the door. I said, "Mr. Vance." He stopped. I said, "What did you mean on the phone when you said, 'Maybe you're the one'?" He stood with his back to me for a long moment. Then he turned, just enough to see me out of one eye. And he said, "I meant some places wait for a particular person. They don't know who, but they know when she walks through the door." He turned again, and he walked out. The brown sedan started up, crunched back down the gravel drive, past the rusting cars, past the bushes, past the gate, and it was gone. Rosalind and I stood in the front room, sunlight pouring in through the holes in the roof, the wind moving through the broken windows, carrying the smell of wet wood and earth and something else, something underneath that I would only learn to recognize much, much later. The smell of time. Rosalind touched my arm. She said, "Hattie, what did you just buy?" I looked around at the room, at the broken ceiling, at the dust, at the keys in my hand. And I said, "I don't know yet, but somewhere underneath my ribs, in a place I didn't know I had until that morning, something said, 'You're about to find out.'" Rosalind left at 4 o'clock that afternoon. She had to get back to the boys, to her shift, to her real life. The one with babies and bills and the clock that kept running. She hugged me at the gate. She held on a long time. She said, "Hattie, if you need me, You call. I don't care what time. I said. I will. She said. Don't sleep in there tonight. I said. Roz. She said. Hattie. I said. I have to. She closed her eyes. She nodded. And she walked back down the dirt road toward the bus stop. The afternoon sun, cutting long shadows behind her. I stood at the gate until she disappeared around the bend. And then I was alone for the first time in my entire life. Truly alone, 18 years old, on a property that nobody else wanted, with a suitcase, a bottle of water, half a pack of saltine crackers, and a key that probably hadn't been turned in 40 years. I walked up to the house. The wind was moving through the broken windows on the second floor, making a sound I didn't have a name for, somewhere between a sigh and a song. I stood on the front step, and I just listened, because Grandma Pearl used to say, every house has a story, and you don't get to live in it until you sit still long enough to hear it. So I sat down, right there on the stone step, with the dust and the leaves. I closed my eyes. I listened. And the house. The house didn't say anything yet, but it didn't tell me to leave either, which was something. That first night was the longest night of my life. I made myself a corner in the front room, swept it with a straw broom I'd found in the hallway closet, wrapped myself in the quilt Rosalind had given me from her grandmother, put the suitcase next to me, like a friend, and I tried to sleep. I could not sleep, because every sound in that house, every creak of wood, every drop of something somewhere far away, every gust of wind through the broken windows, felt like a footstep, felt like a voice, felt like a hand on the back of my neck. It wasn't the kind of fear you have of ghosts. It was the realer kind. Fear that the roof might come down. Fear that some animal might be living in the walls. Fear of the absolute dark. The kind of dark you only get on rural property. The kind of dark that swallows your hand if you hold it out in front of you. Because, of course, there was no electricity. So I lay there, in the corner, with the quilt pulled up to my chin, and I prayed. Not big prayers, small ones. Lord, let me make it to morning. Lord, don't let the ceiling fall on me. Lord, don't let anything be in here with me, please. Around 3 in the morning, I finally drifted off, and I dreamed of Pearl. I dreamed she was sitting on the porch step with me, just like she used to, with a green plastic cup of lemonade. And she was patting my hand, and she was saying, baby, you are exactly where you need to be. I woke up at sunrise, the light coming through the broken windows, in long gold, slanted bars, like someone had reached down and tipped honey across the whole front room. I sat up, and I thought, maybe I can do this. Maybe. I worked for 4 days. 4 days of nothing but sweeping, hauling, sorting, opening windows to air the place out, figuring out which floorboards I could trust and which ones I needed to walk around. By the end of day one, I had a pile of debris in the front yard the size of a small car. By the end of day two, the downstairs was breathable. By the end of day three, I'd found things that surprised me. A solid walnut dining table, under a tablecloth that had become its own ecosystem. The wood underneath, still beautiful. A glass cabinet in what must have been the dining room, with 3 of the cabinet doors still intact. And inside, crystal glasses, dust thick on them, but unbroken. A grandfather clock in the library, stopped at 4:17, standing tall against the wall, like it was still waiting to chime. I found things that the world had given up on, but that had refused to give up on themselves. And every time I found one of those things, something in my chest cracked open a little wider, because I knew that feeling, the feeling of being something the world has given up on, but that has not given up on itself. By day 4, I had a routine. Wake up at sunrise, walk down to the creek behind the property, fill my jug with water, boil it on a little camping stove Rosalind had loaned me, eat whatever I had, get to work. It was on day 4 that I found it. I was on the floor of one of the downstairs rooms, the smallest one, probably a study at one point. I was testing the floorboards, pressing each one with my hand before I trusted my weight to it. The boards were old, but solid, until my palm pressed down on a board near the center of the room, and it didn't crack. It didn't sag. It moved, like a hinge. I sat back on my heels. I pressed it again. It moved again. I brushed the dust away. There, cut into the floor, was a square outline, so well fitted to the surrounding boards that if my hand hadn't touched that exact spot, at that exact pressure, I would never have known it was there. A trap door. I sat there, on my knees, staring at it. For a long time, my heart was beating in a way I'd only felt twice in my life. Once when I'd nearly fallen out of a tree at 8 years old, and once when my mother had said the word all right. This was that kind of heartbeat. I leaned closer. In the center of the square was an iron ring, set flush into the wood. So flush you'd never see it unless you were looking. I pulled my phone out, turned on the flashlight, shone it on the ring. I sat there for a few more seconds. I thought, Hattie, you are 18 years old. You are alone. There is no cell service, no electricity. No one knows where you are right now. Maybe you should wait until daylight. Maybe you should wait until Rosalind comes back on Saturday. Maybe you should not. Open this. Except I had bought this house, every board, every nail, every brick, every secret, for $16. And if I was going to be the kind of person who owned a place like this, I needed to know what it was hiding. I hooked my finger into the ring. I pulled. The trap door came up with a long, dry, slow sound, like a sigh somebody had been holding in for 40 years. Dust rose. I waited for it to settle. I shone the flashlight down. There was a staircase, wooden, steep, going down into the dark. I counted the steps, 8. I started down. 1 step, 2, 3. The wood under my shoe didn't crack, didn't groan. Whoever built this, built it to last. 4, 5. The temperature dropped, the way it does in a basement that has held its own climate for decades, without anyone disturbing it. 6, 7, 8. My shoe touched packed earth. I lifted the flashlight, and I lost my breath. I lost it, not in a metaphor, in an actual way, because the flashlight beam moved across the wall in front of me, and the wall in front of me was not a wall. It was a painting so large it covered the entire stone surface from floor to ceiling. A woman, with her face turned slightly away, hair like dark water, looking at something the painter had not shown. I moved the flashlight to the right. Another painting. I moved it again. Another. I turned in a slow circle. The whole room was full of art. Paintings hung on the walls, stone walls, going floor to ceiling. Some of them framed. Some of them just stretched canvas. Some of them so large they leaned against each other in stacks along the sides of the room, wrapped in cloth that the years had yellowed. I lifted the flashlight higher. The ceiling was wood, maybe 8 feet up, solid beams, built to hold weight. In the center of the room, a long work table made of dark wood, stained with decades of paint. The colors had crystallized into the grain like geology. On the table, brushes in glass jars. The bristles hardened. Tubes of paint, dried out. Wooden pallets layered with old color. Notebooks, leather-bound, stacked carefully. Letters, bundled with ribbon, still in their envelopes. Newspaper clippings, in languages I would later realize were French and Italian. And in the corner of the room, a cylinder of rolled canvases standing upright in a wooden rack, like umbrellas, waiting for someone to use them. I walked into the center of the room. I sat down on the dirt floor. I put the flashlight in my lap, and I started to cry. Not the kind of crying I had done in the bathroom at the bus stop. Not the kind I had done when I read the sheet music in my mother's closet. A different kind. A kind I had never cried before. It took me years to figure out what kind it was. It was the kind of crying that happens to a person who has spent her whole life feeling invisible and who has just stumbled into proof that there is another way to exist. Proof that you can leave something behind in this world that will last after you are gone. Proof that there is a language underneath words, underneath shouting, underneath silences and slammed doors. A language that does not rot, does not age, does not disappear. I sat there for a long time. I did not touch anything. I just sat and looked. When I finally got up to leave, I walked to the table and I picked up one of the leather notebooks, very carefully, with clean hands, like Pearl had taught me to handle her Bible. I opened to the first page. The handwriting was small, slanted, disciplined. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who took her time. In the upper corner of the first page was a name. Cordelia Ashworth. April 12th, 1948. I climbed the 8 steps back into the daylight with that notebook held against my chest like it was a baby. I sat on the front porch and I started to read. For the next 2 weeks, I lived 2 lives in one life. I was Hattie Monroe, 18 years old, sweeping dust, eating crackers, going to my shift at the grocery store 3 days a week, pulling weeds out of what used to be the front garden. In the other life, I was a girl in 1948, walking into a sunlit studio with a paintbrush, listening to a wind that nobody else could hear. I read those notebooks the way some people read scripture. Cordelia Ashworth had been born in 1912, daughter of a stonemason from East Tennessee. Her mother had died when she was very small. Cordelia had been raised by her father and a kind older woman from the next ridge over named Nellie, who came twice a week to cook and clean. From the time Cordelia was a little girl, she drew. She drew on everything. On the back of grocery receipts, on the inside covers of her father's almanacs, on the floor of the kitchen with charcoal she pulled out of the stove. Her father did not understand it, but he did not stop her. He saved every drawing in a wooden crate by his bed. When Cordelia was 23, in 1935, she got accepted to an art school in New York on a scholarship funded by a women's society that her father had never heard of, but that had heard, somehow, about her. She went. She studied for 2 years. In 1937, she got a second scholarship to go to Paris for a year. She went, and what came back from France in the spring of 1938 was not the same girl who had left, because Europe in 1938 was not a place you could leave without bringing something heavy home with you. The notebooks from that period were short, pages and pages of half-finished sentences, pencil sketches in the margins of dark windows, long silences between entries. Cordelia came home to East Tennessee. Her father had died while she was gone. She inherited his savings, modest but real. And she did something nobody in her town expected. She bought a piece of land, 22 acres, at the bottom of a ridge where no road went, and she built a small farmhouse on it. She lived in that farmhouse, alone, for a long time, drawing, painting, filling notebook after notebook. And then, many years later, something on that land was going to change. But I did not know that yet. What I knew was that she lived there, alone, for decades. 5 different galleries came to her over the years. The notebooks recorded each one. A man from New York in 1956 offered her the moon. A woman from Atlanta in 1961 said her work belonged in museums. A man from Charleston in 1964. A couple from Chicago in 1965. And one final gallery from Nashville in 1967. She turned every single one of them down. She served them tea. She listened. She was polite. And then she said no. There was one entry I read so many times I memorized it. She wrote, "A gallery man came up from Nashville today, stayed an hour, said I was wasting my talent, said I was a coward, said I was depriving the world of something the world had a right to. I served him tea. I let him speak. And when he was done, I told him this. Sometimes the bravest thing is not to put yourself in the window. Sometimes it is to keep the candle burning in a place where the wind cannot reach it." I closed that notebook, and I sat on the porch for a long time, because I had spent my entire life believing that being seen was the same thing as being safe, that if enough people looked at you, you would be okay, that if you were quiet and invisible and good, you disappeared. And here was a woman who had figured out the opposite, who had said, being seen by the wrong people is more dangerous than being unseen by everyone, who had built a candle of her own, with her own hands, and kept it burning, underground, in a room with stone walls, for decades. I started bringing the notebooks down to the studio with me. I would light a kerosene lamp Ezra had left in the kitchen pantry, set it on the work table, and read by that yellow flame, with Cordelia's paintings around me. Watching, listening. I had this feeling, the whole time, that I was not reading alone. I wasn't scared. I just felt accompanied. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after I had moved in, I read something that changed everything. It was in a notebook from 1950, just a short entry. Cordelia wrote, "The sound of the engine overhead pulled me out of my work today. He flew low, like he always does when he knows I'm in the garden. Silas and his airplanes. Sometimes I think he does it on purpose." I stopped reading. I sat up straight. Silas. Who was Silas? I flipped backward through the notebook, looking for him. I flipped forward. He came up again. 3 pages later. In a sentence so small you could miss it. He landed today. He brought peaches. He said the orchard man owed him a favor. He stood in my kitchen and ate one over the sink. I painted his hands later. From memory. He landed. Landed. I sat there with that word in my head. Landed. I went outside, to the back of the property, where the 2 airplanes had been sitting for who knows how many years, with moss thick on the fuselages. I stood between them. I looked up at them. I touched the cold metal of the nearest one, and I whispered, "Silas, I went back to the studio. I started searching, not casually now, not flipping pages, searching. I pulled every notebook off the shelf. I went through the bundles of letters. I picked through the bookcases. I looked under stacks of canvas and in a drawer I hadn't opened before. In the bottom of an old wooden desk shoved against the back wall of the studio, I found something. A locked drawer, of course, because every story has one. I sat there, looking at the keyhole, for about 3 minutes. I tried a bobby pin from my hair. I tried a paperclip from my pocket. I tried praying. The third one worked. The drawer slid open with the kind of stiffness that meant nobody has opened me in a long time. Inside were letters, a whole stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, all written in the same hand, steady, plain. A man's handwriting, the kind that doesn't waste a letter. Dear Cordelia. I lifted the top one out. I sat down on the dirt floor of the studio, and I started to read. What I read made me set the letter down, stand up, walk to the bottom of the staircase, and sit down on the third step with my head in my hands. Because this house, this big stone mansion, with its arched windows and its uneven staircase and its hidden studio under the floor, was not built by Cordelia. Cordelia had lived for years in a small farmhouse on this same land. But the mansion, the stone mansion, with the trapdoor below the floorboards, Silas Vance built this mansion. He built it for her. Every stone, every window, every uneven step on that staircase she wanted, he built for her. The letters were all from him, written across the 2 years of construction, 1951, 1952, 1953, describing each room as he built it, as if he was giving her a gift. That did not exist yet, but that he could already see, with absolute clarity, in his own mind. There was one letter, dated March of 1952, that I read so many times that the ink started to blur. He wrote, I had them open the room beneath the floor today, the stone room, 8 steps down, just like you wanted. The mason looked at me funny when I told him the dimensions. He said, Mr. Vance, this room is for a person, not a cellar, I said. That is correct, sir. He didn't ask again. The walls are stone, just like you said. The steps are uneven, just like you said. There are 8 of them, just like you said. Because you told me when you go down slow, or you don't go at all when you walk down those steps. The first time, Cordelia, I want to be in the room, waiting for your face. I sat on that third step for a long time, the candle of my flashlight on the dirt floor next to me, the paintings watching me from the walls. I was 18 years old. I had grown up in a little house with a stepfather who hated me and a mother who painted blue doors with me on Saturdays and then closed them. I had never seen love like this. I had never even imagined it. a man, building a woman, a house, and in the basement of the house, a room with its own staircase for her paintings to live in, so that the world could not steal them from her. That was love. That was what love looked like. When somebody understands what scares you so well that they build the answer out of stone with their own hands. I had to go outside. I climbed the 8 steps, closed the trap door behind me, walked out the front door, sat down on the porch, and just breathed for a long time with my hands on my knees. I watched the sun set behind the airplanes. I tried to picture him, Silas Vance, standing in a kitchen, eating a peach over the sink, flying low over the property so that she would look up, walking through a half-built mansion with a builder's measuring tape and a woman's name in his head. I tried to picture her, Cordelia Ashworth, painting his hands from memory. I went back inside. I lit the lantern. I went down into the studio, and I read every single letter until 2 in the morning, and from those letters, and from the notebooks, I started to put the story together, piece by piece, the way you put together a quilt, from scraps that somebody else cut long before you were born. They had met in 1949. It was one of the rare times Cordelia had driven into town for supplies. She was 37 years old. She drove a brown Ford pickup with a flatbed she had loaded with new canvas rolls and tubes of paint. She came around a bend on the highway, and she saw him, a man, beside the road, with a small 2-seater airplane parked in a hayfield, the cowling open, his head halfway inside the engine compartment. She stopped. She backed up. She got out. She asked if he needed help. He looked up. His face was streaked with grease. He was a pilot. He had served in the Pacific, a pilot in the war, discharged at the end of 1945. He'd come back to Tennessee, worked odd jobs, saved his pay, bought a small airfield from a man who was retiring, built up a little business flying mail, hauling cargo for the farmers in the hills, doing what work he could find. He was in his late 30s, the kind of man whose hands still trembled, sometimes, from things he never talked about, from a war that had taken something from him that he had never quite gotten back. He had never been married. He told her the engine was a carburetor problem, nothing she needed to worry about. She said, "I know the difference between a carburetor and a piston. My daddy was a mason, but his daddy was a mechanic. If you want a second pair of eyes, I have time." They stood beside that road for 2 hours, the airplane open between them, talking about engines and about paint, about her year in Paris, about the war he had seen from the cockpit, which was different from seeing it on the ground, but not lighter. 2 hours. In the years that followed, he flew over her property, more often than any work route could explain. She never complained. Sometimes, when the weather was clear, She would hang a white sheet on the fence post in her front garden, and he would know. He could land in the back pasture. He kept 2 airplanes, one for work, one for himself. She painted. Filled the basement of the new stone house with paintings nobody would ever see. Wrote in her notebooks. Turned down gallery offers. Served tea to people who didn't deserve it. And waited for them to leave. And then, in the middle of all of that, I started to understand. Why 11 cars? Because Silas Vance loved machines. He was not a collector. Not in any organized way. He didn't buy them for status. He bought them because he loved them. Because each one made a sound, or moved a certain way, or smelled a certain way that he had to have. And when one finally broke down, beyond what he could repair, he couldn't bring himself to scrap it. He drove it to Cordelia's. He parked it in the field, where it stayed, because each one of those cars was a piece of his life he couldn't let go of. The Ford from the 40s he'd driven home from the war. The Chevrolet from the 50s he'd driven on their first long trip together. Up to the Blue Ridge, the pickup truck. He'd used to haul lumber. When he was building this house, each of those rusting hulks was a chapter, and he had left them in her field because he had not been able to throw them away. I read into the night, and then, in September of 1968, the handwriting changed. The entries got shorter, sparser, like Cordelia was writing with a thumb on her chest, trying to slow her own heartbeat. There was one entry, in October, that said only, "Silas left today. I don't know if he is coming back." That was all. No explanation. No context. I sat there in the studio with that notebook open on my lap, and I stared at those 2 sentences until the lantern flickered, and then I started to search through the rest of the notebooks, through the letters, through every drawer I could open. I searched for hours, looking for the answer to the only question I now cared about. What happened to Silas? I was just about to give up, to climb the stairs and try to sleep, when I went back to the painting on the back wall, the one that took up the whole stone surface, 2 airplanes, flying over a field of golden grass at what looked like sunset. I stood in front of it. I had not looked at the back of any of the paintings. I tilted the corner of the canvas, gently, away from the wall. There was a small envelope taped to the back of the frame, yellow, faded, the tape brittle and curling at the edges, but still there. After all this time, waiting. I peeled it off. I sat down on the dirt floor. I opened it. The letter inside was long, longer than any of the others. The handwriting, normally so steady, was uneven in places, like the hand had been shaking, or like the writer had stopped to breathe many, many times. It was dated October 8th, 1968. He wrote, "My dear Cordelia, by the time you find this, I will be gone, and I have to ask you, now, not to go looking for me. You know I have been flying cargo runs for 3 years, for an operation I thought was medical supplies, to clinics in places the regular freight companies wouldn't fly. I want you to know that I believed that. I would not have flown a single mile if I had known from the beginning what I know now. 3 weeks ago, I opened a crate by accident during refueling. I do not need to tell you what was inside it. I refused. The next route, I told the man I work for I would not be flying anymore. He laughed. He said the records they kept of my flights would say whatever they wanted them to say. He said if I went to anyone, he would make sure my name was the one on every shipment, including the ones with my real signature, including the ones close to your property. I cannot, Cordelia, let your studio be touched by any investigation. I will not have men in suits going through your paintings, looking for evidence. I will not let your work be a footnote in some other man's crime. So I am going. For how long? I do not know. The airplanes I leave behind, because I cannot take them without drawing attention. The cars I leave behind, because they are pieces of a life that belong to a man I am about to stop being. The house I leave behind, because I built it for you, not for me. You asked me once what I felt when I was up in the air, with the whole world looking small and ordered, the way it never seems. From the ground, I never knew how to answer. But now, as I am leaving, without knowing when I am coming back, I think I know. What I felt was the same thing I feel when I come down those 8 steps and stand in the middle of your paintings. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Take care of the studio. Take care of the work. I will come back when my name is mine again. I sat on the dirt floor, holding that letter for so long that the lantern burned itself out and the dark came down, slow, across the paintings, one by one. Silas Vance never came back. I called Professor Holbrook in the morning. I'd gotten her name from the small art department brochure I'd grabbed off a desk at the community college, 20 miles down the road, the week before. When I had stopped in to ask about evening classes, I called her office. I told her I had found a collection of paintings in a property I had purchased. I told her I needed someone to look at them. She said, "How many?" I said. "More than 100. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "What is the name signed on the work?" I said, "Cordelia Ashworth." I heard her drop something. I heard her say a word that a professor probably shouldn't say. Then she said, "I'll be there tomorrow morning. Don't touch anything else. Don't show anyone. Don't open any more letters. I'll be there at 9. She arrived in a faded blue station wagon with a canvas bag and a notebook and a pair of cotton gloves in her pocket. She was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back and glasses on a chain and a face that looked like it had decided 20 years ago to be kind, no matter what. I walked her into the house. I led her to the room with the trap door. I lifted the boards. I turned on the flashlight. I went down first. She followed. When her feet touched the dirt floor, when she lifted her head, when the beam of light moved across the first painting, she did not say anything. She walked, slow, around the entire studio, with her hand over her mouth. She stopped at one painting. She stood there for almost 10 minutes, without moving. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were wet behind her glasses. She said, "Hattie," I said. "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Do you know what you have here?" I said, "I'm starting to." She said, "No, I don't think you are." She took her glasses off. She wiped them on the hem of her shirt. She put them back on. She said, "Cordelia Ashworth is one of the great lost painters of the 20th century. American art history has been hunting for her work for 40 years. Some people believed the paintings were destroyed. Some people believed they were quietly sold off to private collectors after she died. Nobody knew this collection was here. You are standing in the middle of one of the most important private art discoveries in American history." I just stared at her. She said, "Honey, how old are you?" I said, 18. She closed her eyes. She said, "And you bought this property," I said, "for $16. She turned, looked at the wall of paintings. She said, very softly, "Hattie, I have to tell you something. Before we go one step further." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to me. She said, "By tonight, people are going to know. I'm going to do my best to keep it quiet. But word travels. And when it travels, there are going to be people who come for this, with lawyers, with smiles, with cash offers, with threats. I need you to understand that you have just walked into a fight that you did not start and that you may not be ready for." I looked at her. I thought about the door in December, closing on me. I thought about my mother in her closet, with the sheet music sealed in a shoebox. I thought about Cordelia, painting alone, in the candlelight, for 30 years. I thought about Silas, flying away in 1968, with a name that wasn't his anymore, promising to come back. I looked at Professor Vivian Holbrook, and I said, "Ma'am, I have been in fights I didn't start my whole life. This is the first one. I actually want to win." She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. Once. She said, "All right, then, let's get to work." Vivian Holbrook was right. About all of it. By the end of the week, the county knew. By the end of the month, the state knew. By the end of the third week, he arrived. A black town car with out-of-state plates pulled up to my gate on a Tuesday afternoon while I was on my knees in the front yard, pulling weeds out of what used to be a flower bed. The driver door opened. A man got out. He was tall, maybe 60, in a gray suit that looked like it cost more than my whole life, hair the color of polished steel, a briefcase, and a smile. It was the smile that scared me, because it wasn't a smile that meant, "Hello." It was a smile that meant, "I'm about to take something from you." He walked up to the gate. He said, "Miss Monroe." I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Beaumont Crane, from the law firm of Crane and Whitlock. I represent two of the heirs of Cordelia Ashworth, her great nieces. May I come in?" I said. "No, sir." He smiled wider. He said, "I think you misunderstand the gravity of this situation. Miss Monroe." I said, "I don't think I do." He laughed, a short laugh. He opened his briefcase, right there, on the dirt outside my gate, pulled out a manila envelope, slid it through the bars. It fell at my feet. He said, "Take a look at the offer inside. Take your time. I think you'll find that it solves all of your problems, permanently." I looked at the envelope. I did not pick it up. He said, "Miss Monroe, I have done this a long time. There are two ways this can go. The easy way, where you take what is generous and go live your life, or the other way, which is long and expensive and not friendly to a young woman with no resources." I looked up at him. I said, "Mr. Crane, the gate is locked. Have a good day." His smile dropped half an inch. He said, "I'll be in touch." And he got back in the town car, and he was gone. I picked up the envelope. I walked into the house. I sat down at the dining room table. I opened it. Two pieces of paper. One, a purchase offer for the entire estate. Land, house, contents, including the studio, and every painting, and every notebook. $40,000 for 134 paintings by one of the lost masters of American art. I almost laughed. Except I almost cried. Because $40,000 to a girl who had walked in here with 16 was a whole lot of money. The second piece of paper was a list of dates, of court precedents, of cases where heirs had taken back disputed estates from buyers who had purchased property under, quote, irregular circumstances. It was not a friendly list. It was a list designed to make me feel like a small animal in a very large trap. I sat at that table for a long time. And then I called Rosalind. I said, "Roz." She said, "Hattie." I said, "I need you to come up here tomorrow, if you can." She said, "I'll get someone for the boys." She didn't ask why. That was the kind of friend she was. The week that followed was the worst week of my life. The letters started coming. Crane and Whitlock, letterhead. Every 3 days. Each letter a little colder. Each one citing a different statute. Each one with a return address that I did not want to know existed. Then the phone calls, late at night, 11, 12, 1 in the morning. The phone in my kitchen would ring. I would not answer. It would ring 12 times, then stop, then ring again. 20 minutes later. Then, on Thursday night, I was upstairs, with a candle, reading one of the last notebooks, when I heard tires on the gravel. I looked out the window. A car, parked, outside the gate. Headlights off, just sitting there. I watched it for 30 minutes. It did not move. It did not pull away. It just sat. When it finally left, I did not sleep. I sat on the staircase with my back against the wall, watching the front door, until the sun came up. The next morning, I drove down to Rosalind's apartment in town. I sat at her kitchen table. I tried to drink the coffee she put in front of me. I could not. I just started crying. Rosalind sat across from me, holding my hand, letting me cry. She said, "Hattie," I said, "I can't." She said, "Hattie," I said, "I can't fight this. I don't even know how." She said, "Hattie, listen to me." I looked up. She said, "You bought a mansion with $16. You walked alone onto a property that nobody in this county would set foot on. You stood in the dark with a flashlight, and you said, 'I want it. You are not the girl who can't fight this. You are the exact girl who can.'" I wiped my eyes. She said, "Now, who is the only person who knows where Ezra Vance lives?" I blinked. I said, "What?" She said, "Ezra Vance, the man who sold you the house, who hasn't returned a single one of Vivian's calls, who you have not laid eyes on since the day he handed you the keys." I said, "Rosalind," she said, "find him." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because there's a reason. He sold you a mansion for $16, and you need to know what that reason is before Beaumont Crane uses it against you." I sat there. She was right. She was right. I went home that night. I tore the house apart, looking for any record of Ezra Vance, any phone number, any letter, any old address book. What I found was an envelope in the bottom of one of Cordelia's painting cylinders, where she had stored her tax records. A small envelope with a return address, a street name, in a town called Briarcliff, about 30 miles east, up in the hills. I looked it up. It wasn't a residence. It was a post office box. Of course it was, but Briarcliff was a town of about 400 people, tucked between two ridges, only one main road. I figured, maybe, just maybe, if I drove up there, stopped at the diner, asked the right person, I could find him. So, on a Saturday morning, I drove up the mountain in the rented sedan Vivian had loaned me for weeks like this one. I pulled into Briarcliff at 10. I parked outside a diner called Maples. I went in. I sat at the counter. I ordered coffee and toast. The waitress was maybe 70, with a name tag that said Doreen. She looked at me, then at the rental car outside, then back at me. She said, "You're not from here." I said, "No, ma'am." She said, "Lost." I said, "Looking." She said, "Looking for who?" I said, "Ezra Vance." She set the coffee pot down. She did not say anything for a minute. Then she said, "Ezra is in the home, off the bypass road, about 6 miles back the way you came." She wrote something on a napkin. She slid it across the counter. She said, "Tell him Doreen says hello." I said, "Yes, ma'am." I left a $5 tip on a $3 bill. I got back in the car. The Maplewood care home was a single-story building, white, with a wheelchair ramp and a garden, late autumn flowers still hanging on by their fingernails against the cold. I parked. I went inside. A nurse looked up from a counter. I said, "I'm here to see Ezra Vance." She said, "Are you family?" I said. I paused. I said, "Yes." She did not ask me to prove it. She just stood up, walked me down a hallway, knocked twice on a door near the end, opened it. She said, "Mr. Vance, you have a visitor." She closed the door behind me. The room was small. A bed, a chair, a window, looking out at the garden, a small bookshelf with a Bible, and a few photographs in cheap frames. In the chair by the window sat Ezra Vance. He looked smaller than I remembered, smaller and older. But when he turned his head and he saw me, his face did something. He didn't say my name. He just put his hand to his mouth, and he held it there. I walked across the room, slow, took the second chair, pulled it in front of his, sat down. He lowered his hand. He said, "You came." I said, "I came." He said, "I knew you would." We sat there for a minute. I said, "Mr. Vance, there are people trying to take it. The paintings, the land, all of it. lawyers, from out of state, heirs nobody has ever met. He nodded, like he had already known. He said, "Of course there are." I said, "I need to know why you sold it to me for $16. Because, whatever the reason is, I think it might be the only thing that can save it." He looked out the window. The light came across his face in the same slow gold that came through the holes in my mansion roof every morning. He said, "How much do you know about Silas Vance?" I said. "I know he built the house. I know he loved Cordelia. I know he left in 1968 and never came back." He closed his eyes. He said, "Did you wonder why my last name is Vance?" I felt my throat close. I said, "Mr. Vance." He opened his eyes. He looked at me. He said, "Silas Vance was my father." I had to grip the arms of the chair. I said, "Your father?" He said, "Yes." I said, "But," I said, "but." I couldn't finish. He said, "Sit with me for a minute, Hattie, and I will tell you the whole thing." So I sat, and he told me. He said, "Before Silas met Cordelia in 1949, there was a woman. Her name was Hannah. She was a nurse in Knoxville. Silas was in his middle 30s at the time, a few years home from the war, still trying to put a life together, with his hands shaking, the way men's hands shook when they came back from things they couldn't talk about. Hannah was kind to him, the way nurses know how to be. They were together, briefly, the way two broken people sometimes are, for a little while. Then she moved to take a job in another city. They lost touch. She didn't know yet that she was pregnant. By the time she did know, he was already up in the hills, trying to build the airfield. She thought about telling him. She decided not to, because, by then, she had heard that there was someone else, a woman with a long brown braid, who lived in a small farmhouse on a piece of land, by herself. Hannah figured she had no right to interrupt that. She raised me, alone, in a small house, in Memphis. She was a good mother, tough, smart, she told me, until the day she died. That my father was the kindest man she had ever known. I was crying. I didn't even know when I had started. Ezra reached over. He patted my hand. He said, "In 1968, when my father vanished, I was a young man, not married yet. Hannah hadn't told me his name. She kept saying she would. When the time was right, she said. 2 months later, she got sick. Cancer. Fast. The way it sometimes is. On the night she died, in a hospital bed, in Memphis. She handed me a piece of paper with a name on it, and a town, and a woman's name in parentheses. Silas Vance, Hill Country, Tennessee. Cordelia Ashworth. I did not understand. The parentheses. It took me a year to drive up here. I knocked on her door in the spring of 1970. She opened the door. He stopped. He had to. I waited. He said. She looked at me for about 5 seconds, and she said, "I know who you are." I said, "You do." She said, "Get in here. You look like him." She gave me coffee. She sat me at her kitchen table, and she told me about my father. For 4 hours, she did not cry. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask for anything. She just told me who he was. And then, at the end, she said, "Ezra, you are my responsibility now." I said, "Ma'am, no." I said, "Yes." He smiled. He said, "She was a difficult woman to say no to." I laughed. It was the first laugh I had laughed in weeks. He said, "Cordelia, from that day, paid for my schooling. She paid for my first apartment. She wrote me letters once a month for 17 years, until the year before she died. She never had children. I never had a father. We invented something between us that doesn't have a name in any dictionary. I know. She was the closest thing I had to a parent in the second half of my life. I sat back in the chair. I said, "Mr. Vance." He said, "Yes." I said, "Why am I just hearing this now?" He said, "Because Cordelia died in 1971, and in her will, she left the entire property to me, with one condition." I said, "What condition?" He looked at me. His eyes were so clear. In that moment, so clear. He said, "Sell it to the first person who does not ask about the past. That person is the next part of the story." I closed my eyes. I said, 40 years. He said, "Longer than that, as it turns out." Hattie, so many people came over the decades. So many investors, reporters, restorers, heirs, people with money, people with cameras, people with cousins. Every single one of them asked, "What happened here?" I sent them all away. You were the first one who did not ask. I opened my eyes. I said, "Because I didn't want to know. I just wanted somewhere to live, he said. I know. He reached into the small drawer of the table next to him. He pulled out a folder. He set it on my lap. He said, "This is the original will of Cordelia Ashworth, dated 1971, signed, witnessed, notarized, filed with the county court, probated, legally executed by an attorney named Beulah Penrose, who has been dead now for 20 years, but whose paperwork is on permanent file in the basement of the county clerk's office. Inside this folder is my deed, showing that I have legally owned this property since 1971. And inside this folder is the deed of sale from me to you, dated, filed, and legally binding." I looked down at the folder. I looked back up at him. I said, "The heirs," he said, "have no claim." I said, "But," he said, "they were never mentioned in Cordelia's will. They were great nieces by marriage. She did not know them. They did not know her. They saw an article about 134 paintings, and they hired a lawyer from out of state who is hoping you will fold before this gets to a courtroom." I said, "He is good at pretending it's about to." Ezra nodded. He said, "I have watched men like him my whole life. They are loud until you show them paper. Then they are quiet." I held that folder in my lap. I felt something in my chest, something I had not felt in weeks. A small, hard, bright thing, like a match that had not gone out. After all, I said, "Mr. Vance," he said. "Yes," I said. "Why did you wait to tell me?" He looked out the window. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because Hattie, Cordelia did not want the next person to be chosen. She wanted the next person to choose." I went to Vivian Holbrook's office on Monday morning with the folder under my arm. I sat across from her at her desk in a small cluttered room lined with art books and student paintings tacked to the walls. I laid the folder open. She read it for about 3 minutes. She looked up. She said, "Hattie," I said. "Yes, ma'am." She said, "This is airtight." I said, "I know." She said, "But the court of public opinion is not airtight. Beaumont Crane is going to try to make this about morality, about a young woman taking advantage of a confused elderly man. Even if the law is on your side, he is going to drag you through every paper, every news segment he can. We need to take this out of his hands permanently." I said. How? She said. We file with the State Historical Commission to have the entire collection declared a protected cultural and historical archive of Tennessee. If that is granted, then the paintings are no longer just private property. They are protected patrimony with legal status. That makes any reclaim by remote heirs almost impossible. It will take months. It will take testimony. It will take experts. But it is the right thing to do, and it will end. Beaumont Crane. She looked at me. She said, "But Hattie, you have to understand, if we do this, the paintings can never be sold privately. They have to be kept in the public interest forever. Are you prepared to never make a dime off of them?" I looked at her. I thought about Cordelia, about her line. Sometimes the bravest thing is not to put yourself in the window, I said. Ma'am, they were never for sale. Let's protect them. Vivian smiled. The first real smile I had ever seen on her face. She said, "Then let's go to work." The next 4 months were the hardest and the most beautiful months of my life. There were hearings. There were depositions. There were experts who flew in from Atlanta, from Boston, from New York, to look at the paintings, to authenticate, to write up reports, to stand in front of commissions and testify that what I had under my floorboards was history. Beaumont Crane fought us. He fought hard, but every motion he filed, Vivian filed 2 back. Every expert he brought in, Adelaide Whitmore, the pro bono lawyer Vivian had connected me to, the one who specialized in cultural property law, came in with a longer resume. And every time, I sat in those rooms, in a blouse that Rosalind had loaned me, with my hands folded in my lap. I thought about Pearl on the porch, about my mother with her piano, about Cordelia with her candle, and I did not look away. In late February, the State Historical Commission ruled in our favor. The Cordelia Ashworth Collection, 134 paintings, 12 leather notebooks, 307 letters, was officially and permanently declared a protected cultural and historical archive of the state of Tennessee. Beaumont Crane filed an appeal. It was denied. He left the state. I never heard from him again. I was sitting in the hallway on a plastic chair when Adelaide walked out of the courtroom with a piece of paper in her hand. She didn't have to say anything. I just started to cry. Vivian, sitting next to me, put her arm around my shoulders, and she said, "Cordelia, we did it, honey. We did it." I went home that night I lit the lantern. I went down the 8 steps. I walked to the painting of the 2 airplanes. At sunset, I put my hand on the canvas. Lightly, I said, "She's safe." The wind moved through the broken windows, upstairs, and somewhere, I think, I felt it. I felt it move down the staircase like a hand on the back of my neck. Light. Just light. The restoration of the mansion took 11 months. I hired a builder named Otis Henderson. He was 71 years old, with hands the size of skillets and a voice that sounded like gravel poured on more gravel. He drove up to the property on his first day, got out of his truck, stood with his hands on his hips, looking at the stone facade. For a long time, he did not say a word. Finally, he turned to me. He said, "Miss Monroe." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Whoever built this house knew what he was doing." I said, "I know." He said, "What was his name?" I said, "Silas." Otis nodded. He said, "Well, we are going to take good care of Silas's house." And he did. He restored the stone, piece by piece, using a brush and a pail of water and his own 2 hands. He saved the wooden floors where he could. He replaced what was beyond saving with wood from a mill in the next county that cut to old specifications. He left the staircase with its uneven steps exactly as Silas had built it. He fired one of his men on the 3rd day. I asked him why. He said, "Tried to put aluminum on a banister that is older than my mama." He built a new banister himself, by hand, in his garage, forged the iron in his own backyard furnace, brought it up to the property in the bed of his pickup, with his grandson helping him carry it. The studio was restored last with the most care. A team from the state came up to advise on preservation, on humidity, on lighting. We installed a small system, discreetly, that kept the air at the exact level Cordelia had always known her paintings needed, even before she had the technology to do it. When the final inspection was done, and the last man with a clipboard drove away, I walked down the 8 steps, alone. One more time, I stood in the middle of the room. I turned slowly to look at each wall. The paintings glowed in their new light, like they had been waiting for somebody to turn the lamps on. 8 months in, I started teaching. It began small. A girl from the foothills, maybe 10 years old, with holes in her sneakers, and a notebook she had filled with drawings of horses She came to the gate with her grandmother, who had heard, through Doreen, at the diner, that there was a young woman with a fancy art house out on the old Vance property who might be willing to teach. I let them in. I showed the little girl the studio. She did not say anything. She just walked around it in a slow circle. And when she got to the painting of the two airplanes, she stopped. She looked at her grandmother. She said, "Meemaw, there are airplanes out there in the yard." Her grandmother nodded. The little girl looked at me. She said, "Did the same person paint these as built those?" I said, "No, baby. The man built the airplanes and the woman painted the picture. They loved each other." She thought about that for a second. She said, "Like married?" I said, "Not exactly, just together." She nodded. She said, "Can I come paint here on Saturdays?" I said, "Yes, you can." That was the first one. Within 3 months, there were 11 of them. Little girls, little boys, with paint on their sleeves and shoes that didn't fit. Vivian sent 2 of her senior students to help with the lessons. I covered the cost of the supplies with a small monthly grant from the Historical Commission for the upkeep of the archive. Every Saturday morning at 9, a row of kids would line up at the gate. I would unlock it. They would come in, and we would paint until noon. I would tell them the same thing every single Saturday. I would say, "What you make in this room is not for your teachers. It is not for your friends. It is not for the people who hurt your feelings or who say, 'You can't be a painter.' It is for you. That is the only person who has to see it to make it real." A little boy with freckles once raised his hand. He said, "What if I make it for nobody?" I said, "Then you make it for the person you are going to be in 20 years, who is going to look back and see that you made something with your own 2 hands when the world was not paying attention." He stared at me for a second. Then he nodded, and he went back to his painting. I waited 4 months to write the letter to my mother. I waited because I did not want to write it out of anger, out of revenge, out of "look at me now." I wanted to write it from a quiet place where nothing in me needed her. In June, I sat down at Cordelia's writing desk in what used to be the library. I took out a sheet of stationery. I wrote, "Dear Mom, I am living in a house up in the hills near a town called Briarcliff. It is big and old and full of light. In the afternoons, I think you would like it. I am painting with children. I am safe. I am eating. I am sleeping. I am okay. There is a woman whose journals I have been reading. She was a painter. Her name was Cordelia. I think about her most days. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm not writing to forgive or to be forgiven. I am writing because I did not want, for the rest of your life, to be silent. The address is on the envelope. I love you, Hattie. I dropped it in the mail on a Tuesday in the post office in Briarcliff. I did not expect a response. For 2 months, I did not get one. And then, on a Thursday in August, a small blue car came up the driveway, slow, almost, like the driver wasn't sure. She had the right place. I was on the front porch, drinking sweet tea. I watched the car pull up to the gate. It stopped. The driver door opened. My mother got out. She was thinner than I remembered. She was wearing a yellow blouse I did not recognize. She stood, with her hand on the open car door, looking up at the house, like she did not know what to do next. I stood up. I walked down the steps, across the gravel, to the gate. I said, "Hi, Mom," she said. "Hi, Hattie." We stood there for a long time, with the gate between us. I unlocked it. I opened it. I said, "Do you want to come in?" She nodded. She walked through. We went up to the house, slow. She kept stopping to look at things. The mansion, the cars, the airplanes. In the distance, she did not say anything. I made her coffee. We sat at the dining room table, the same table I had once spread Beaumont Crane's offer on. She held the cup with both hands. She said, "Hattie, the house is beautiful." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." There was a silence. Then I said, "Mom, there is something I want to show you." I took her down the 8 steps. She held the railing Otis had forged with her free hand when her feet touched the dirt floor, when she lifted her head, when she saw the paintings. She made a sound, a small, quiet, almost a sob. She walked around the studio, the way Vivian had, the way every person did. The first time, slow. She stopped at a self-portrait Cordelia had painted in her late 40s, sitting at her own work table, in this very room, with a brush in her hand and her hair loose. My mother stood there for a long time. I watched her face. She did not turn around. When she finally spoke, she said, "Hattie," I said. "Yeah, Mom," she said. I had something, once, that was like this, to me. I don't know if I told you, ever, what it was. I said, "I know, Mom." She turned. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet. She said, "How?" I said, "The shoebox in the closet, the week before I left." She closed her eyes. She said, "Oh." She said, "Oh, Hattie." I crossed the room. I put my hand on her arm. I said, "Mom, I am not going to tell you that it's okay what happened, because it wasn't. But I want you to know I understand a little more now than I did that night. And that little more is enough to start." She put her hand over mine. She did not say, "I'm sorry." She did not have to. We stood there in Cordelia's studio, two women from the same family, with our hands touching. And for the first time in 4 years, we were standing in the same room without a door between us. She started coming up. On Saturday mornings, she brought sheet music. I had told her about the kids, about the paint, about the supplies, about the noise. I had said, "Mom, they would love a piano." She said, "I haven't played in 25 years." I said, "That's okay. I haven't painted in 18 years. I'm figuring it out." She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh since I was 12. She brought a small upright piano in the back of a friend's truck the next month. We put it in the front room where the light came in through the windows that Otis had restored from Silas's original glass. She started by teaching 2 of the kids, then 4, then 8. By the end of the year, we had painting on Saturday mornings and piano on Saturday afternoons. Otis built a new flower bed in the front yard. I planted tulips. The mansion that the whole county had been afraid of for 40 years became a place where children came to make things that were just theirs. Ezra Vance passed away in December of the second year. I was with him. I had been visiting every Sunday afternoon for 19 months, bringing him photographs of the restoration, of the studio, of the kids, of my mother. Sitting at the piano, he had liked the photographs of the kids best, he had said once. She would have loved them. Cordelia would have loved them. I had said, I know. On his last day, I sat with him. I held his hand. He had asked, months before, to be buried next to Cordelia in the small family plot on the back acre of the property where she had been buried in 1971, under the dogwood tree that her father had planted when she was born. I made sure that he was. I had a small headstone made with his name, and underneath it, I had them carve the first person who chose to stay. The 11 cars are still there. So are the 2 airplanes. I have not moved a single one. People ask me, Sometimes, why I don't have them hauled away, I tell them, those cars are not junk. Those cars are the pieces of a man's life he could not throw away, and the airplanes are the pieces of a man's life that he could not take with him when he left. They belong here. They were here before me. They will be here after me. Last spring, I put up a small wooden sign by the gate. It says, "The most abandoned place in the world can become the most alive. All it takes is for someone to decide to stay." Cordelia Ashworth. Underneath the sign, I added one line of my own. In smaller letters, it says, "Saturday mornings, children welcome." Sometimes, when the light hits a certain way, late in the afternoon, I walk out to the back of the property and I stand between the two airplanes. I don't do anything. I just stand. I think about Silas out there somewhere in 1968, putting his hand on a propeller for the last time. I think about Cordelia in her studio, hearing the engine for the last time. I think about a young woman at a bus stop in December, praying for one step, just one. And I think about what Pearl used to say, "The Lord puts us exactly where we need to be, even when we can't see the map." Sometimes the places that the world has thrown away are the places that are holding the most. Sometimes the doors that close in your face are the doors that were never yours to begin with. And sometimes, 18 years old, in December, with nothing, is exactly where the next chapter of your life has been waiting to begin. I never imagined standing where I am now, a mansion behind me, a studio below me, 134 paintings, sleeping in the dark, watching over me, the way mothers watch over their daughters. 11 cars, 2 airplanes, a piano in the front room, and on Saturday mornings, a line of kids at my gate with paint in their hair. If this story touched you in any way, if somewhere while I was telling it, you thought about a door that closed, about a person you loved, about a dream that you put down a long time ago and told yourself you weren't allowed to pick back up. I want you to take just one thing from this, the most abandoned place, maybe holding the most valuable thing, the thing you did not know you needed until you walked through the gate and opened the door and said, I want it, even though the world said you couldn't have it.